Pride and Prejudice is an 1813 romantic novel written by Jane Austen, which criticized and satirized the then-contemporary Regency era of Britain. Pride and Prejudice follows the story of Elizabeth Bennet and her unexpected relationship with Fitzwilliam Darcy, with Darcy and Elizabeth respectively being the titular Pride and Prejudice. In the social hierarchy of Regency England, both Darcy and Elizabeth are ranked among the wealthy landowning class of the gentry, who do not have to labor throughout the day like those below them in social class, but can spend their time in leisure like everyone above them in the social ladder. But even amongst those classes, there's a lot of internal squabbling and social climbing between the merely wealthy and the very wealthy, and in Elizabeth's case, her mother was not from the gentry class, which further lowers her social standing. Understanding the period in which this book takes place with its underlying culture and social hierarchy is important to grasp the story, but more than anything else, this book should be celebrated as an exploration of human beings and their vices, a story that's evergreen and always relevant even as customs and cultural attitudes have shifted. I've read this book 3 or 4 times, and at every point in my life, it brings something a little new that I didn't appreciate before, and it critiques me in a new way I didn't expect. Nearly every character in the book has a serious vice which is obvious to the reader because of the way in which Jane Austen presents the story, but is maddeningly hidden from that character themselves. And where that vice is less obvious, it's likely that the reader simply enjoys some bad quality without thinking too hard about the fact that it's bad. This is evident right from the get-go with the relationship between Elizabeth Bennet's parents, where Mrs. Bennet is unabashedly obsessed with devising ways for her daughters to climb the social ladder of Britain, while Mr. Bennet uses these schemes and the folly and impropriety of his wife as a source of amusement since he doesn't care much about social standing. Mr. Bennet's witty remarks at his wife's expense are so amusing that at first they mask the seriousness of Mr. Bennet's lack of leadership in his family and authentic care for his wife, which the reader may not pick up on because Mrs. Bennet's flaws are so obvious, frustrating, and forward-facing. But as the story unfolds, these issues become more clear. The inciting incident of Pride and Prejudice is the arrival of the wealthy Mr. Bingley to the countryside where the Bennets live, and his hosting of a ball at his manor, Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet, of course, begins machinations to get Mr. Bingley to fall in love with one of her daughters, which he surprisingly begins to do to Elizabeth's sister Jane. After repeated social engagements after the ball, it begins to seem like Mr. Bingley will actually propose to Jane, which Mrs. Bennet starts gossiping about everywhere, when suddenly Mr. Bingley leaves town for London and cuts off all contact, leaving Jane heartbroken. What the Bennets do not know is that Mr. Bingley's friend, the even more wealthy Mr. Darcy, persuaded Bingley that Jane was only into Bingley for his money, which Darcy genuinely believes due to Jane's reserved manner which he takes to be indifference. Meanwhile, Elizabeth has recently received a far less welcome, but more real, offer of marriage from the clergyman Mr. Collins, her cousin who is set to inherit the Bennet family home because Mr. Bennet has 5 daughters and no sons. Mr. Collins, however, is an enormous bore, with incredible vanity about his station in life, and Elizabeth will not marry him, much to the chagrin of her mother. The disgruntled Mr. Collins immediately turns around and convinces Elizabeth's best friend Charlotte to marry him instead, despite the fact that Charlotte has no interest in him. This shocks Elizabeth, who, like her father, has always prided herself on her own good judgment. Yet Charlotte sees things very differently, being both older than Elizabeth and more immediately in need of money. Though things get off on the wrong foot at first, Elizabeth renews her friendship with Charlotte by visiting the new Mrs. Collins at her home near Rosings Park, the estate of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Mr. Darcy's aunt. There, Elizabeth learns via mutual acquaintance that it was Mr. Darcy who arranged to separate Jane and Mr. Bingley. Additionally, Elizabeth has grown to resent Darcy not only for his pride among the poorer and lower-station people when he was at Netherfield, but also for supposedly defrauding a well-liked soldier named Mr. Wickham of his inheritance from the late Darcy Sr. Elizabeth is therefore more than a little astounded when, after a few polite meetings, Mr. Darcy proposes to her. Things in the novel have been progressing very differently from Mr. Darcy's perspective, and as he makes overtures of love, he fully expects that Elizabeth will accept his proposal since his station in life is so superior. Elizabeth tells him, in a very polite British way, to get bent, much to his consternation. In this scene, Elizabeth believes herself to be fully in the right by rejecting an odious and self-important man, and Mr. Darcy believes himself to be condescending to marry someone of low birth, despite his better judgment, out of his extreme passion for Elizabeth. The language here is absolutely delightful, and Austen's dialogue between these two self-righteous people justifies reading the whole rest of the book. I found myself rereading it as I was writing this video. Parting as amicably as possible, Mr. Darcy tells his version of events via letter to Elizabeth, where he explains that he believed Jane to be indifferent to Mr. Bingley, and he notes the behavior of Mrs. Bennet, who had the audacity to talk to everyone as though Jane were already engaged. He also explains that Mr. Wickham is a gigantic liar who once made a pass at Mr. Darcy's teenage sister in an effort to steal her money by convincing her to marry him. So Darcy is understandably wary of gold diggers, which he correctly appraised Mrs. Bennet of being via the proxy of the actually blameless Jane. Through this common ordeal, Elizabeth begins to self-examine the ways in which she was prejudiced against Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy examines his own conduct and tries to address his pride. Long after this encounter, Elizabeth unexpectedly finds herself touring the ginormous Darcy family estate, when her aunt and uncle hear that it's open for tours. Elizabeth never told anyone about the proposal, and without a good reason to tell her relatives she won't go, she follows along. From Mr. Darcy's housekeeper, Elizabeth gets a very different picture of Darcy than she and most others got of Darcy at Netherfield. She learns about his many good qualities and kindness, and she learns about his generosity with his money to the poor and disenfranchised. I think Darcy's generosity is really important to his character, and I was surprised that the movie version of the story left it out. Maybe the 6-hour BBC show left it in. I hear that show is basically the extended edition of The Lord of the Rings, but for women. Mortifyingly, Mr. Darcy himself appears, though he was supposed to be out of town, surprising everyone. In addition to everything else, Mr. Darcy's social capital with Elizabeth continues to rise when he shows himself to be extremely polite to her aunt and uncle, and she's gratified to introduce them since her aunt and uncle are much more civil people than her mother is. Things seem to be taking a turn for the better between Darcy and Elizabeth, but soon, tragedy strikes when Elizabeth's foolish youngest sister Lydia runs off with the soldier Mr. Wickham, which makes Mr. Bennet realize he's been too lax in disciplining his daughters, especially his younger ones. Given what both Elizabeth and Darcy know about Mr. Wickham, it's pretty obvious to both of them that Mr. Wickham doesn't intend to marry Lydia, since the Bennets don't have any moolah, and to make matters worse, nobody can find out where Lydia went. Mr. Darcy, however, proves his change of attitude and affection for Elizabeth by hunting down Wickham and paying him off so he will actually consent to marry Lydia to save the Bennet family from scandal. He even makes Elizabeth's uncle take the credit for arranging everything. Darcy also recants his testimony against Jane and gives Mr. Bingley permission to marry a Bennet. Elizabeth's words, not mine. At which point Mr. Bingley returns to Netherfield and proposes to Jane. Elizabeth, meanwhile, has essentially flipped her opinion of Mr. Darcy, not only because he's done so much to ingratiate himself through acts of kindness or the use of his money, but because, with her prejudice cleared away, she's come to appreciate his temperament and see the sincerity of his affection. One last wrinkle presents itself to Elizabeth, however, when Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is 3 times as proud as Darcy, comes to town to tell Elizabeth to keep her hands off her nephew, which has rather the opposite effect on Elizabeth, and when Mr. Darcy hears that Elizabeth has annoyed his aunt, he deduces that his chances with Elizabeth are not as bleak as they used to be. Darcy quickly arrives and proposes a second time, and this time, Elizabeth of course accepts. The book ends with a fun little epilogue about the life of Darcy and Elizabeth. All around a great novel, and probably the best of Jane Austen's work. I've read Emma and Persuasion, and unsuccessfully tried to make it through Mansfield Park, but I think nothing beats the enemies to lovers storyline crafted here. I hope this work continues to be an enduring classic.